Welcome back to Houdini 101. My name is Jared, and this is the series where I'm taking you from your very first time opening SideFX Houdini to having a finished product animation at the end. My goal is to get you caught up on the user interface, geometry importation, lighting, texturing, animation, and rendering. In our last episode, we went over a basic lighting setup in Redshift and Houdini. Today, we're going to move on to texturing, and I'm excited to get into how shaders are both created and assigned in Houdini so that we can kind of get to learning about the different ways that materials can be applied. Today, we'll start by creating our shaders and then assigning them and then going back in and fine-tuning the actual materials themselves in the end. Let's get started. So this is where we left off in our last episode of this little series. From now on, we're going to be going back and forth a lot now between our viewport and a Redshift render view. So what I'm going to do is come over here to this plus icon in my viewport network. I'm going to go new pane tab type, and I'm going to bring in a Redshift render view. This will allow us to kind of go back and forth between our render view and our viewport very easily just by kind of switching back and forth. You can put this wherever you want, or if you have a second monitor, I recommend putting it over there, but I'm just going to keep it on screen for the sake of the tutorial. First, we need to create our shaders. This is going to take us out of our object network for the first time in this tutorial. So I mentioned in the first tutorial that the network view houses several different networks. The main one that we've been working in thus far is the object network. Today we're going to introduce the material network, which is this matte icon here. The number of shaders that we create in this part is going to be heavily influenced by the model that you're using. If I go into my AirPods Max model here, I have 4 shaders that I need to create in order to make this work. We might need to make more later, but for now we're going to go about just creating 4 empty shaders, and then we're going to assign them. And then we are going to come in and actually edit them and fill them out with these images. To create a Redshift material, what we need to do is hit Tab in our material network, and we can come down to this Redshift tab here, or you can just type RS Material Builder and we'll drop it in. This is basically our full output material that will be assigned to an object in our scene. And if you dive into this by hitting I, just like we do in the object network, you can see that we have our output and our material where we'll actually input different properties to edit this shader. I'm gonna go up and I'm going to name these so that they're easy to keep track of based on the different parts of my AirPods model. This first one here is going to kind of be the ear cup type material, and so I'm just gonna call this ear cup mesh. And then I'm going to create another Redshift material builder. Drop that into my material network, and then I'm going to create this fabric mesh. I'll call this one fabric mesh. Create another one. I'm going to call this mesh underscore inner, and then I will create one last Redshift material builder, and I will call this mesh underscore top. And so now I have all of these created, and these are going to be the different mesh materials that are used throughout this model. Now, assigning materials in Houdini was the hardest thing for me to really kind of grasp in this whole process at first. So what we're going to do now that we have all of these created is we're going to go back into our object network. Now, if your object is one single piece of geometry, you can just highlight it, and you'll see up here in your render tab in the parameters window that you can just assign a material to be rendered here. And you can do that by coming over to this selector here. This is called a selector operator. And you can open your material network, and then you can just select one of the materials that we just created. This works great if you have UV mapped textures or just one model that has one texture, such as like a rock or, something environmental like that. But that's not going to work for us because we have all of our different parts that need to be textured separately. To handle this, we're going to have to go into our headphone out nodes that we made. And what we're going to do is we're going to texture these with groups. If I drop in a material here, and I'm just going to do this as an example, you can see that this material that I drop in gives me options to assign a material to a group. Groups in Houdini are used to isolate geometry or points or vertices or whatever you end up needing to separate out. Groups are one of the best ways and most used ways to create an isolation of a specific group of units. I'll give you a quick example. Let me come to the earbud here. We should, if I come into my scene view, we should be able to just see this huge rendition of these. If I come in here and I hit tab and add a group node, and I can drop it in between these two nodes so that it's already hooked up and everything, you can see that I can give this group a name. And essentially, the geometry being plugged into this group will be isolated as its own group of polygons. And what I can do is name this group earbuds. And then if this material is dropped in after our merge node, what we can do is come into this material, hit this drop down, and then we have this earbuds group show up that we just created. And so then what we can do is come into this material and we can assign this material that we created, so mine would be ear cup mesh, to the earbuds group that we made earlier. And now if I zoom back in here, you can kind of see, obviously we haven't actually set up our material yet, but it is nonetheless assigned to this part. So I'm going to delete these so that we can kind of start from scratch. I know some of this can be intimidating as we go over it initially, but long story short, we need to create groups in between all of these nodes, and then we'll be able to put one material node right here and go about all of our material assignments at one time. So I'm going to start by hitting tab and just dropping in a group node. And I'm going to do that in between my merge nodes. And I'm just going to, sorry, that was incorrect. I'm just going to go through and do this for all of these nodes. I'm now going to go back and name these groups appropriately. So to name a group so that you can remember it by its texture, you're not going to want to change this name. This does not actually have any effect on the group name. What you need to do is come into the node itself and come up to the group name, and that will be the actual name assignment for the group. So if I look at what this actually is, I'm just going to call this AirPods underscore Chrome. For this one, I will do AirPods earbud outer. On this one, this is going to be black plastic. This one we have inner white plastic. Microphone underscore mesh. And it doesn't actually matter what you name these. These are just things that I know that I'm going to remember as I go forward in this process. So if you have like a wine bottle, you'll just name yours like cork or bottle or label or whatever you have. So now I have all of these nodes named. This is getting a little messy, so I'm going to just click anywhere in my network view, and I'm going to hit L, and then I'm going to hit Shift S, and maybe then I hit L again, and now we kind of have these laid out a lot better. We are done. Once you have these named appropriately, we're done with this big massive tree up here, and we don't have to touch it again, so we are all good there. I'm going to switch back to my object network now, and we're going to get some of these synced up. I'm going to dive into my headphone out, create a material node, and drop it in after our merge node. So if I highlight my material node, you'll see what we can do is add a different number of materials. So if we couldn't do this, what we would have to do is add an individual material node to each of these lines here, and we would continue working in this massive tree. But since we are able to assign a different number of materials, what's nice is we can kind of just tackle this all at once in this one node. So no more messes in this tree. I have 9 parts, so I need 9 materials, but you can go about this with whatever number you need. So just like I showed you in the example earlier, what we have to do is assign a material to a group. And if I hit this drop down arrow here, you can see all of those groups that I just created are right up here, ready to go, ready to be selected and materialed. So what I'm going to do is I'll start with this top mesh one, just since it's right here. I will go and then use my selector object here to link this with my mesh underscore top material that I made. And so you see, I can now just go through and go to the second one in this second tab up here, hit this drop down, go to top, and I know that this top node refers to this silver material. Can go into 3, hit my drop down, go over to the silver sides. This is going to also be this silver material. And so you can see as we go down the list here that we are able to just make these and assign them, and they will already be assigned to our object. And so I'm going to finish my assignments up now, and you can do yours, and I will meet you back here in just a second. So now I have all of my different pieces textured to one degree or another, or at least I have the materials assigned. And if I come over to my render view, we should be able to see, Redshift render view, sorry about that. If I come into cam 1, go over to my render view and refresh. These all have material assignments, and now we just get to go back into our material network. So I'll hit U on my keyboard to get out of this and come up into my material network. And now we just get to do material assignments here. So I'm going to start with my top mesh, just like I did earlier. If you're unfamiliar with the texturing process, there's probably a lot more research to do on this. But I am going to show you just what's necessary for my materials here, and I will probably do some more in-depth texturing materials or texturing tutorials in the future. But for now, I'm just going to hit this little hit this little arrow next to my base properties, and that is going to give me all of the options that I need to sync up this material. Now in Redshift, images are brought in via RS textures or Redshift textures. So if I hit tab in this menu, I can type RS texture and drop one of these in here. My file name, we're going to need to specify where this material lives on our hard drive. So if I hit my little picker there, I can come into my file system where my model lives, and I'm going to uncheck show sequences as one entry because Houdini sometimes thinks that images are sequences when really they're not. If I right click in here, I can hit show images, and that's going to be helpful for knowing what we're looking at. And so my top mesh is these textures here. So I need my diffuse, and now I can go ahead and pipe that into my diffuse color. I can add another RS texture, hit my little picker, add in my opacity channel, and that'll come down to my overall opacity color right here. And then lastly, I will add another final RS texture, and I will add in my bump map. Now, bump maps in Redshift require an actual bump map. You can't just use a texture. So I'm going to hit tab and click, or type in RS bump map, and I need to drag this in, and then I can plug this out color into the input because this is what's going to be driving our bump map. And we can drag our bump output into the overall bump input. And so now if I come over to my Redshift render view, you can see that our texture is showing up here. And there's probably going to be some fine tuning to do, but that is why we went ahead and assigned these materials so that we can go through and make adjustments accordingly. So now that we have everything set up accordingly, what we can do is just go through all of these other materials that we made and set them up with our image textures, or do some texturing of our own, some procedural texturing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into my object network. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a floating camera so that as I work on these textures individually, I can go through and move a camera around that will allow me to update my render view with exactly what I want to see in real time. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to hit tab, I'm going to create a new camera. And this camera doesn't have to be anything fancy. I'm going to switch to it and lock it. Mine is already locked, but this is the lock camera button, so we'll just click that. I will back it out a little bit. I want to rotate it, move it around a good bit. And so let's say I was working on this top material that we already put on. I could just park this camera here and come into my Redshift view, and then I'm free to work on this material as I wish, and I can just switch back and forth between my scene view and my Redshift view to move my camera accordingly. So I know that this is probably the most vague and maybe least helpful of these tutorials that I've done so far, but the reason is just that materialing and texturing is such a deep kind of subject all on its own that it's hard to really describe everything in a super beginner friendly manner. But I hope that I've done a good job of explaining how materials can be assigned. Now I'm going to go through and do the rest of my materials and meet back up with you after that to kind of go over some final thoughts and other things that you may want to know when doing your texturing. So as you can see, I've just kind of finished up texturing this model. I'm going to lock my camera to camera 1 and kind of move around here so you can see some. The main takeaways for texturing in Houdini is being organized as you assign your materials. It can get really messy, especially if you have a lot of objects, and so being organized with group names and using groups in general can be a really big thing for keeping a project kind of cohesive, because it can be really difficult to keep track of all the different things going on inside of meshes. I hope you were able to follow along As we continue to go through this, there will be more explanation about lighting, as in the next episode we will be doing some camera animating and just general scene building. I hope this was a helpful introduction to assigning materials in Redshift and Houdini, and I hope to see you in the coming episodes as we dive into building this animation. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in episode 5.